So I'm going to request the panelists to offer their insights and comments and suggestions to us. May I first call upon Mr. Bhattacharya.
Being a part of this expert panel for these 4 areas of governance, which is a part of your study of assessing the quality of governance in Indian states. I must first say that it is a very bold step to take such a study, because apart from the statistical exercise which is to be done with the data, on which I don't have enough competence, but probably there are others in the audience who can have competence. There are a couple of other problems which I would like to mention. One is a choice of the parameters. There probably, to be fair to the panelists, there should have an opportunity for closer interaction among themselves without fear, favor, without anything, free exchange of views, a little bit of shouting, etc., so that they could come to some sort of a consensus about the parameters. Without that, the panelists feel a little hesitant about subjecting the parameters, because they are not experts on each area. Probably some longer interaction among the panelists to choose the parameters would have been useful. Secondly, there is the definitional problem also. If the data have been collected from the websites of the states or from the state governments, there is no guarantee that uniform definition has been followed by each state government. Because I have a lot of experience of working with academics who are dealing with the government data, and it takes time to explain to the academics in this particular context what is the department trying to capture when they give this particular data, because sometimes same item may be amenable to very different definitions, and ultimately some statistical analyst or a section officer or somebody will give some figures which will go up and become the state government's figures. And it will vary from state to state also. The same parameter, if you take the values from different states, there is no guarantee that the same definition, same method of calculation has been adopted by all the state governments. That has to be borne in mind. Thirdly, of course, you have expressed that you have to do some quantification, you have to take some parameters, give them some values, and operate some statistical techniques on them. But quality of governance, it is sometimes may not be very quantifiable. I'm not very good in Shakespeare and literature and all that, but there are some quotations which talk of something falls from heaven and you have to capture that and all sorts of things. Quality of kindness, quality of charity, quality of human way of doing things. These things are slightly vague, but these are the foundations of governance. Whether you are looking at the poor person, the minority, the marginal elements of society with charity and kindness and without contempt and all that, that is a very, very essential element of governance. I don't know how you capture it through quantified records, quantified figures. So with all this caveat, let me now mention a few specific points. I'll start with only 2-3 areas to which I have been able to apply my mind to some extent. One is the fiscal management. Now, it came as a very strange revelation to me, or the figures given here appear to be very strange and maybe totally unacceptable to me. Maybe a subjective assessment, but I'll try to elaborate. Uttar Pradesh number 1, Assam number 2, Jharkhand number 3, Odisha number 4, Madhya Pradesh number 5. Now, by our common understanding, most of them are what is the low per capita income states of the country. Most of them probably get special dispensation from Finance Commission because their income is below the per capita average of the nation and all that. Now, what is the objective of fiscal policy of a state? It is not merely to reduce the debt burden or minimize fiscal deficit. As I mentioned in a note or a mail I sent to Dr. Atraya, that if you follow this reductio ad absurdum principle, if a state collects no resources, spends no money out of its own pocket, whatever comes from the center it spends, then there will be no deficit, no debt. Will that state be considered to be a model for fiscal efficiency or fiscal management? I don't think no. Now, unless the fiscal management has at least 3 components: revenue collection, which has been admitted here, expenditure management, rational expenditure policy with the goal of having growth, development with social justice, whatever it is. And, of course, debt management, so that your debt management level is not too high, repayment of debt or interest is manageable, etc., etc. But by these criteria, I can't accept that all this Uttar Pradesh, Assam, Jharkhand, Odisha, Madhya Pradesh are the model of fiscal management, because over a period of last 60 years, or when did we start our planning? 1951, 52 or 50, 51, whatever it is. So we are now 65 years of planning. After that also, if these are all backward states, have not, obviously they have not been able to, apart from other problem, manpower problem, education problem, etc., etc., probably they have not been able to collect enough resources with which they could conduct, development expenditure, which would have, if efficiently spent, led to some development of the state. Now, in my opinion, it will be inviting public ridicule if we say these are the best fiscally managed states in the country. So we have to have a look at, I had mentioned in my mail, per capita resource mobilization. And here again, I think this 3-year average, or what is the compounded annual rate of growth of those ratio, may not be very relevant. If a state has been collecting, let us say, 10% of the SDP as resources, or 9, 10, 11% over a period of 5 years, 8 years, 9 years, and you say that, oh, their CAGR is not good, because they have been always good. From 8%, they have brought 8.5%, whereas some state, from 4.5%, they have brought to 5.9%. They are much better because the percentage becomes very higher. That is not acceptable to me. Now, I have an opportunity to study the budget of some of these states in connection of some study I have done. At one point of time, I don't know what is the latest position, Orissa, for example, after paying the salary, interest, and pension, there is no money left for anything. And maybe they have improved the situation now. A similar situation might have prevailed in some of these backward states also. So it required a much thorough study, much more intelligent assessment of the data, and linking it with some broader objective of fiscal management, not limited to only debt management, to come to some figures which will be, come to some ranking which may be in line with normal perception of educated people who read Economic Times or Business Standard or economic issues, etc. Because we must see that it is acceptable to such readers. On fiscal management, I don't have anything else to mention at the moment. I have a small point regarding this women and child development. I think there, Kerala has been ranked at top, which I think will be acceptable to practically everybody. But I saw some disturbing news about Kerala. I read some disturbing books, book at least, published by the Center for Development Studies, Trivandrum, which talks about the position of women in Kerala society is not as rosy as it is made out to be. And there are data regarding domestic violence in Kerala, which is probably much more prevalent than many other states in India. Probably you should have a second, your ranking may remain the same, but the value assigned to that state may undergo some change if a thorough look is given to some factors like domestic violence, actually accepting women as property owner in Kerala. You know this famous case, forget the name of that lady, Mary Roy's case. Even after that, I don't think there has been substantial change in the Kerala society regarding allowing women to actually hold property. Now, these kind of things may be available, some data will be available. If you consult Center for Development Studies, we may be able to get some more data. So probably that should be taken note of. Thirdly, I come to this law and order subject with actually a sense of trepidation in my heart. Because I do not know whether in the country today I'm able to talk freely on the subject. That talks a lot about minimum government and maximum governance. Now, take Tamil Nadu, ranked as number 1. Last few months you had been reading some novelist belonging to the backward caste or social caste or whatever you call it, is prohibited practically from writing, almost under threat of death. And state observes silently. Somebody has written some poem, I read, poem or some name, Kovan, about the ill effects of alcohol, or the nexus of which I am aware in most of the states. I was an excise commissioner of the state long back. The nexus between politicians and alcohol dealers or contractors or manufacturers. Because he has written that, the fellow is silenced. I don't know what has happened. Is he in jail or something? He's in jail. No. There may be other instances I am not be able to with everything. But general perception about Tamil Nadu is not that people are getting showers from heaven about freedom and liberty and things like that. I think the same is true of a number 2 state, Gujarat. I don't want to delve too deeply into this, but I have sent some mail. A judge who passed order about a lady minister who had done gruesome atrocity on other women, was inducted as Minister in charge of women welfare, if I am not mistaken. And The case was being investigated by the state government, I think. I don't remember all the legal details. The High Court or Supreme Court said that no, they are not doing it properly, send it to Maharashtra. And after Maharashtra government, just like this Jayalalitha's Tamil Nadu case was referred to Karnataka. Poor Karnataka chief minister didn't know what to do. I mean, these things have landed up on his hand. So like that, this case went to Maharashtra. After that, the lady was sentenced to whatever it is, I don't know what is the punishment given to her. And the judge, lady judge again, said, I am being threatened, I am getting threatening call. And she said, I made the additional chief secretary. I didn't get any response. And there are so many other cases, how many DIGs or IGs or DGPs are in jail or something else and all that. So maybe these things are not captured in the statistical data coming from the police stations. How many policemen are there? How many cases have been registered? How many custodial dates are there? Now, how do we capture this? Our perception of these two states, Tamil Nadu and Kerala, are not the state where freedom, liberty, law and order is flourishing. But if you go purely by some statistical data generated from police station, you may get these kind of figures. So this will be distortion of the reality. Now how to change it, how to make it more rational, reasonable, acceptable, I do not know. But I feel that in the situation, I like to recuse myself, to use a judicial expression, from further participation in this discussion. Thank you very much.
So we are grateful for these critical inputs which you have given us. And coming from you with your vast experience, it will certainly weigh heavily on our minds as we go ahead to finalize the recommendations. One or two issues which you have raised which requires a certain response. One is regarding the definitional issues. Are the states identifying and defining the parameters on the same wavelength? One of the precautions we took was not to go into state databases. We have deliberately avoided state government databases. Rather, we have gone into union ministry databases, which has a method of rationalization and normalization of all data at a national level. Yes, it is true that data may creep in. States give some figures and the data may creep in into the national aggregation of these statistics. That is possible. One discussion we had about how the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation, SIP, created a few years ago, they try to take care of these aberrations, state-to-state aberrations. And when the final data is placed on the public domain, to the best extent possible, they try to normalize and see that everybody is on the same grid, same definitional understanding. You are looking for how to quantify governance, which is a big issue which in my presentation also I raised it. We are keenly aware of the fact that many of these perceptions of governance cannot be defined. And the challenge before us is therefore to find, as I said, that matrix, combination of indicators, which will in some way approximate to an understanding of governance. We have no other way to do it. For example, you raised the question of perception about Tamil Nadu, perception about Gujarat. And I agree with you. Point is, where is the data? We, as statistical methodology that we are following, we have to depend on hard, cold data. And if the data does not reflect a certain aberration, we understand that there is a limitation there. But where else can we go to? Is there an alternative data system, database, which will give you analysis of the states based on perception? Is there? If it is, we will certainly go to it. Therefore, sir, I just wanted to answer one issue which you have raised. Along with this report, we are going to look at a sentiment analysis. All this is data-based. All this is hard-cold data available on the record. We are also looking at sentiment analysis. And we have engaged a firm called Big Data, which will go into the perception of people about a state. And how do they do that? They go through all the newspapers, about 20-25 newspapers in the country. And a certain software, they feed in a lexicon of words. Suppose you're looking at women and child. All words, about 1500 words related to women and child are fed into the system with a positive and negative index. If the 25 newspapers of the country are reflecting about Gujarat, let us say, condition of women and children there, and giving either a positive or a negative comment, then that is a sentiment. That may not be based on cold hard data, but is a sentiment. So we have arrived at a state by state index based on sentiment and perception, which will not, I repeat, which will not influence our findings here, but will be an additive, an addition, to just give the other view, that what do people generally think about the state, irrespective of data. So I understand the point you raised is very, very crucial to us understanding and our study, but we are trying to balance it because we have no other database to go by. And finally, you are looking for a quotation from Shakespeare, sir.
Well, I'm not very good at that.
Yeah, I think what you are looking for is from Merchant of Venice, when she says, Portia says, the quality of mercy is not strained, it falls from the heaven like the gentle rain. So the governance is also cannot be defined, it falls around us like the gentle rain. And if we try to capture that, well and good, if not, it's our failure.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to now invite Mr. Tangaraj.
One suggestion for the convener, Mr. C.K. Matthew, is before we discuss the outcome on the report in public, maybe the convener should have a meeting with the panel members. The panel should arrive at some sort of consensus. There, I am sure, even when we discuss separately, there will be difference of opinion. And after arriving at a consensus, then only we should go in public. So that will help us. Especially when we give ranking based on numbers, lot of difficulties come. All of you are aware that the Union Public Service Commission, when they give ranking of the candidates who appear for the examination, they do some sort of moderation. They don't simply see a person in, say, history, the first ranking fellow, he has obtained, say, 70%. And a person in chemistry, he has obtained 100%. And to do a sort of ranking, common ranking of all candidates, they do some moderation. I don't know what kind of moderation they follow, but they do some moderation, then only they release the result. So that kind of thing may be necessary before we, because sometimes numbers are misleading. Number 3, when we see percentage improvement, there will be again difficulty, because a state may be having a large base, another state may be having a small base. So naturally, the percentage of improvement, the percentage of growth will be a small base will have it will look as if they have done wonderful, and others broader base state may look moderate achievement, but really speaking that second state has done better than the first state. So that is also possible. So that kind of moderation is required before we finally put the result. Also, as Mr. Bhattacharya ji said, that all the panel members may not be very well aware of all the subjects. So, for example, see, in my case, I am particularly interested in social justice, women and child development, health, so this kind of things, social sectors. I am not very good at fiscal issues. So like that, the convener may take the views of the members based on their experience. And they may also give other things, but they are particularly interested in some subject. Maybe their views should be considered before we finally arrive at a conclusion. And also, see, the indicators, there are some positive indicators, some are negative indicators. I am sure Mr. Matthew must have seen that point before.
Direction.
Yeah, so that is another thing. And here I want to mention one aspect of social justice. Maybe other comments I will send it in writing in a day or two. See, as far as the social justice is concerned, here the percentage of pension beneficiaries and then percentage of household with no land. These two indicators are taken. Similarly, minorities welfare is also mentioned. These are the things coming under social justice. So I think in addition, the development of SC/ST people are also particularly important in terms of social justice. If a state is allocating sufficient fund for development of SC/ST, because the SC/ST population, as you know, is about 25%, much more than almost double the minorities population.
30.
Huh?
Now it has shifted to 30.
It is almost 30%. So 1/3 of the country's population is SC/ST population. So we should find out whether the state is allocating funds which is equal to the population of SC/ST people for what is called SC/ST sub-plan, or earlier it was called special component plan. So that may be one indicator which we may like to see. Similarly, atrocities on SC/ST. In that front, what is the position of the state? See, that will come both under law and order and crime. Also, under social justice, it will come. What emphasis the state government is giving with regard to containing or preventing the atrocities on SC/ST. So these are the two small things which I wanted to mention here. The other things I will put it in writing and send it to you. Thank you. And the efforts made by Mr. C.K. Matthew is very, very laudable.
One is the movement, as is raised this issue. Now let me exemplify this with giving a specific case. Look at the state of Kerala. Literacy is very high, maybe 98%. So how does that state move? Movement will be very slow. The state which has already achieved, more or less achieved its target, how fast can it move further? So you are aware of this problem, that in movement, the better off states, the well-performing states, stand at a disadvantage if we look at only the movement. So in all our data, when we look at 3-year periods, we have given equal weightage to the position as it is and equal weightage to the position of movement. So in a way, we are capturing the status of that state in that particular indicator at that point of time, plus 50% weightage to the movement in the last 3 years. So Kerala, which may not show movement, but is being static at a very high level for many years, will balance out. These two features will balance. This is the argument we took. Now, since he has raised this issue, we will certainly look at it once more. As far as the SC/ST component plan issues which you have raised, very, very crucial to us. Our problem is that SC/ST component plans come through departmental budgets. Different ministries, they come in different sectors. I think 16% and 12% is allotted. And the fact is that because it is coming through different ministries and different departments, there is no aggregation. Data was not available to us. For example, a state like, say, Rajasthan has a planned size of 50,000 crores. 16% should have gone to SC, 12% should have gone to ST. And that is the theory, that is the pronouncement of the government. That's the way it should be. Two problems. One, because it is disaggregated between the ministries, we are unable to capture it together. issue, very fundamental issue. How do you desegregate 16% of, let us say, power? Electricity is coming to the state. How do you say that 16% of the investment made in power is going to SC, ST? It's going to everybody. Can we make a reasonable distinction and say out of that 100 rupees, 16 rupees is going to SC or 12 rupees is going to ST? We cannot say that. So this is an issue that we used to face in state government. While we make the allocation, power is increasing, water availability is increasing, more and more money is being spent. But can we specifically say that a certain percentage is going towards a particular community? And a village may have SC, ST, minority, everybody living together, and everybody is getting the benefit. So again, this point is very valid. We had grappled with it, I remember, in Rajasthan also. Directions were issued. But we'll have to find some method to exclude general services. Water is for everybody, power is for everybody. Exclude that. But find the actual money going to, say, an SC Basti, a scheduled caste area, how much money is actually going. Only then it makes sense. So this point you have raised is very valid, and we will once again examine our documents and come back to it.
Thank you, Dr. Matthew. It's a great effort, partly because I have spent most of my life in looking at data, analyzing data, indicators, interpreting data, and then that's where I have made my life. And so when I see other people dabbling into it and getting confused, I feel very happy because that's how I feel with data. And so generally, one of the points that when I saw this, and generally my area is child and women health and equity and so on, the first sort of thought came to my mind is the source of data, and I'm sure Dr. Matthew has all the sources lined up. But when we are giving any comment, then under each table, under each indicator, I would have liked to see which is the source. For example, if you say female literacy rate, when you say government data, it can be coming out of an NFHS survey, which has a very different quality, National Family Health Survey, or it can be coming from the state government
Census.
or census. Now, when you say census, it has a far more validity. So it's not all government data. So for each one, it would be, so validity of each source of data is very important for me, at least when I look at it. And so then that will also, another question that we would look at is the relevance of the indicator that we are defining. For example, women working women working population ratio. What is it trying to tell us in terms of health? Is it a good thing for child health? Is it a bad thing for child health? Is it a poverty it is indicating? Is it education that is indicating? What is the correlation between the various variables that you have? So the relationship with the validity of what we are trying to measure, relevance of that indicator, and I'm sure the way you are answering other people, you would have answers for this also. But since if I had read the whole report, probably I would not have brought up this issue. So let's see, that's the second kind of, for example, female literacy rate that we have taken, which is sort of saying that is there development happening? But if you are looking at the social justice, then I would have taken the ratio of male to female ratio to see whether females remain far behind male. So the three sort of dimensions that you set out to look at as a governance impact, which is economic efficiency, social justice, and individual liberty, is a far stronger framework around which one can then organize these indicators to make a point which is far stronger. But I must say one thing, that I am very delighted that somebody has attempted to use data, whether rightly, wrongly, not wrongly so much, but use the data, and has created certain shocking algorithm, because people don't look at data. Even if it is wrong, let there be a shock of looking at it. Let the people, they discuss it, let they defend it, and so on. But not using data, which we spend huge amount of money collecting and so is a crime that we are calling. So in that sense, I'm very happy to see this exercise, and more and this thing should be done. I made another couple of points. If I have, I would, the three questions you asked, the methodology, well, in sitting in this sort of setup, it's difficult, but I would give some look at the methodology part, indicators, a little more closely. You are asking any new vision. Of course, I can't tell you now, but have we left out anything is a question you ask. And I wish I would say, can you leave out anything? Because the more and more indicator we have is an indication of less and less we understand about what we are measuring. So if you have 67 indicators, if we can reduce some of them, that means the more we understand about a system, how it functions, you should be able to get, be able to explain it in a fewer indicators. You know, that's general theory about systems theory. So one would like to see what is it that correlated variables can be explored. For example, the beneficiaries of ICDS. Now beneficiaries of percentage, again, so we would have to sit later to see what they are. Beneficiaries of ICDS or utilization of Janani Suraksha Yojana is directly correlated with institutional delivery, how many got and how many delivered. So they are not two independent variables. So that's the kind of analysis we would do. And finally, on two more points. One is the weightages, and it's very inconvenient, uncomfortable feeling to say we decided. In fact, we can have a sort of Delphi type of technique to decide what's the weightage. So you can get some people who are well known in the field, ask them to give weightages, and then make the, at least we can pretend to be measuring those weightages, which is a good thing to do. Similarly, Turing test, what we are deciding is, there are qualitative statistical techniques where you can say, ask in people who are very knowledgeable about of many of these indicators to tell you what you think is the indicator percentage, and those percentages, if they match close to what you have passed the Turing test. Because what I have found always, the people who are knowledgeable about the system know far better about the statistics than what the statistics tells you. So that's the kind of test, I think. And the last point is about the using sentimental analysis based on newspaper. Just a caution, because I remember many of you may also, Walter Cronkite was once asked, why is it that you always tell us bad stories and not good stories? One child apparently wrote, and he answered that the day when I will have to report good stories, it's a sad day for the world. So newspaper telling you bad instances does not mean that it's a negative situation. So interpretation of what the source is, why, the value behind it, what are they trying to tell them, these are all very important things to consider. But it's an absolutely important contribution, and I will encourage you to go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Murthy. By offering these comments, you have made yourself indispensable to us. So we're going to come back to you again and again and take your expert advice. And some of the issues you have raised, for example, are things that we have talked about internally. Yes, while allocating weightages, we had huge consultations, both with statisticians and with developmental economists. At least 3 rounds of discussions we have had with them. We went over to them also and said that this is a call that we are taking by allocating, say, 60 or 70% to particular weightage. Yes, it is questionable, but it is not entirely, as I said, based on whims and fancies. There is some reason behind it. You can always question that decision. Why should it be 70? Why should it be 60, 50? But the point I was trying to make is that there has been, as you are saying, some Delphi exercise has taken place, and we have tried to bring as much of method into the madness as possible. Okay. And we will further sit with you and try to see what we can do to improve the situation.
Thank you, Dr. Matthew. I think I would like to, in fact, congratulate this team, Dr. Matthew as well as the other researchers, for this excellent framework study, because state the governance of a state is not easy to define. So with all those limitations, an attempt has been made to collate all those things in one place, which I think will be an important, tool for others to further improve on it as time passes. And I'm sure even if Samuel Paul was there also, there would have been additional insights which would have gone into the study. It's unfortunate that's not there, but still I think if you think of some positive points, for example, infrastructure. If you see the state which is number one in infrastructure is Punjab. And I would say it's really so richer state. People are comfortable. You can go to many cities really fast. So that way, and one, if you see, Chandigarh is actually a union territory, because the moment you are out of Chandigarh, then you see the problem of the state governance. So the governance of a union territory and the governance of a state are visible in that particular city. But whatever, it has shown that Punjab is number one, I felt good. Even in women and children, also Kerala is number one is a good indication, because by and large, it is there. Of course, there could be problems, because any state you will always have problems. But in general, where the women also, some community have the right for the property, ancestral property and so on. Then in respect of, there are some issues which I thought I will also add to this. But all these will come out where I agree with Mr. Bhattacharya, because I'm his student. And whatever we have learned in terms of state finances and all has really come through him. So probably the observations will be somewhat similar. I think, for example, we are taking Assam as number 2 in the fiscal management. Now, Assam as number 2 in fiscal management because there was no revenue deficit, the debt was low and so on. In fact, like since we also do the studies, we rate the state governments, we came to know Assam had kept almost 8,000 crores with RBI. 8,000 crores they have kept in RBI. That too, they kept it in the treasury bills earning 4% and not, anybody would tell you if you are anyway going to keep it for 5-6 years, don't necessarily keep it in the short term, keep it at slightly longer term and earn a little more interest. They didn't do that. And finally, the money was still there. So Assam, if you have been there, there is only one important road in Assam, which is Guwahati-Shillong Road, GS Road. Everything happens on that GS Road. And if you want to buy an apartment, it is 5,000 rupees a square feet on that. It's even more than what you get in Bangalore. That has happened because the state has not created any other road, no other infrastructure there. So you keep 8,000 crores in RBI, you don't create any infrastructure. And later on, when the 6th pay commission report comes, the entire 8,000 crores was given to the employees. That's not a good fiscal management. The money is meant for the people and not necessarily for the employees, and then you don't do anything. If you had taken 8,000 crores, borrowed another 8,000 crores from the bank, 16,000 crores was there for you to invest in something good for the state, which you didn't do. So I think that way in the fiscal management it is peculiar, but I guess these parameters may have to be moderated along with various other issues. Just to give another example, for example, this Tamil Nadu crime was already talked about, where actually if somebody makes some study like what kind of crimes are registered. Now when AIADMK is in power, the crimes registered will be against only DMK. And if DMK is in power, all crimes will be registered only on AIADMK. So I think this registration of crimes is very peculiar. And also the people seem to be very emotional. For example, now that I think Justice Kumar Swamy, I forget the name, but the one who delivered a favorable judgment for the Chief Minister, Jayalalitha. Now many people are naming their children with Kumar Swamy's name. And that is one thing which they try to do because that kind of emotion they have. But in fact, another thing where we see here, for example, children and women. Karnataka also gets a good rank of 6. Now this good rank of 6, one has to remember, for example, Bangalore attracts a lot of people from all over the country. There are lots of jobs here, maybe 5 lakh engineers may be working in various IT companies, and maybe double that number also are working, like, whether it is a driver or lots of restaurants, a lot of things happening. So that way the growth is there. Of course, the problems are traffic, because when you look at the roads that we have, roads per kilometer, yes, roads may be there, but then you are not reaching anywhere. So that indicators itself may have to be, thought about depending on what we are studying. But in terms of women and children, one has to say, for example, now if you see the laborers in Bangalore right now, where do they come from? If you go and see the real estate projects, no Kannadigas or nobody from Karnataka works in any of these projects. In fact, I don't think you are getting your maidservant from Karnataka at all in here. And what is happening is, of course, you are getting little poor from the neighboring states and all that. But those who work in the real estate, they all come from, earlier they used to come from poor areas of Orissa, West Bengal and so on. Nowadays they are coming from Bangladesh, and many of them are illegal immigrants, because they are the one who are ready to do the work, and most the real estate developers use them. Now if you ask another question, which is the most thriving prostitution center in India? Once again, unfortunately, it is Bangalore. And nobody typically knows this, because the lot of children are kidnapped, means the girls and women are kidnapped from West Bengal, as once kidnapped and sometimes sold by their parents also. So all that kind of a combination comes. See, the West Bengal in terms of crime gets only 6. Obviously they are not aware that this is happening, or they are not even registering those cases. Voluntary agencies, some wonderful voluntary agencies are doing the work. In fact, what they do is, they try to catch the culprit. They go in the form of customers and catch and rescue the girls. And after the rescue, they rehabilitate them. Not only they rehabilitate them, they also prosecute the offender. And they have more than 600 prosecution cases, and they have been successful in more than 200, 300 cases. So these kind of voluntary agencies are working in Bangalore, and quite often they have found all these kidnapped women are housed in various buildings, quite very often near the police stations, all these buildings. That means the police are indirectly supporting them. So I think it's very tough to really analyze the whole thing, because on the face of it, things look better. But I think, as Dr. Nirmala Murthy suggested, maybe some kind of an expert judgment approach. One is more refinement in the statistical methodology, and a little more experts and some kind of getting whatever you are doing, the sentiments, because whatever is possible only one can do. And in addition, maybe some other surveys or whatever, I think the study can be improved. But I would still say at least a beginning has been made, data has been collected, and that itself is a big, landmark where I think it can be improved upon by others. Thank you.
Friends on the panel and in the audience, I must begin by saying that I welcome this initiative very much, especially since PAC is collaborating with law school, and we are in the same city, and there are so many other institutions in this city which can become part of the process. And so I think it opens up the door for inter-institutional collaborative work. I particularly remember, or we must take note of ISAC, NIAS, Indian Institute of Management, and several other private organizations. Law school has always been promoting an interdisciplinary approach. We are now 25 years old, and we are credited with producing high quality social science scholars from, mind you, from among our law students. They have now got PhDs from Harvard, from Cambridge, from Oxford, from London School of Economics. And interestingly, many of them are going into social sciences after having taken a basic degree in law. And there are friends in India who say that this is quite unique. And I think the reason for that is simply not the great excellence of social sciences in the law school, but the fact that we focused on the interdisciplinary approach. And I think that is something we must draw inspiration from. We have reached the high point in that regard by now starting the Master of Public Policy course in our university. And we are drawing students from a varied background. To save time, I will summarize that by saying the single largest stream of students who joined MPP are engineering students. And so that shows, in a sense, something we must take note of, and I hope this relationship will continue to grow. Let me come to the crux of it. I want to begin by taking note of an observation in the papers that we were able to access. It says there's been a judicious exercise of discretion in identifying representative indicators. It is on this issue that I want to begin by referring to the American School of Sociological Jurisprudence, led by a very eminent jurist of global renown, Dean Russo Pound. Now, he and his school have produced a beautiful formulation, and that is called the major inarticulate premise residing in the minds of every judge. As a result of it, he tells us, and that school tells us, give us the names of the judges and tell us what is the subject matter and the composition of the bench, and we'll tell you in advance what the judgment will be. And so it is from that point of view, many of us know that, the major inarticulate premise of Justice D.A. Desai, Justice Chinnappa Reddy, Justice Bhagwati, but we also know the major articulated premise of Justice Krishna Iyer. I think, saying this, what I am asking for is, does the PAC have a major inarticulate premise? And I think that's a factor upon which I'd like, some more thinking to happen. Dr. Matthew mentioned that while looking at the methodology issue, they had assigned weightages. I have no quarrel with that because I have nothing to do with knowledge of methodology. But something very closely related to this is the 67 indicators. And I would like to come back to the 67 indicators, keeping in mind also an observation that Dr. Nirmala Murthy made. I'll try to come back to that. But before that, when we are looking at governance, my key question is governance for what? Obviously, I think the most popular answer will be governance for development. I'm not satisfied with that. I would further ask, what kind of development? I would especially keep in mind the fact that the idea of popularizing governance is a part of the augmented Washington consensus. I come from a trade union movement, so working class comes from subconsciousness. Augmented Washington consensus is the one which popularizes governance. And what role does that have to play in this whole process is a question. In other words, are we, subconsciously trying to do things based upon GDP-based growth? That's one fundamental approach globally, as against quality of life-based growth, as against the capability approach of, let's say, Dr. Amartya Sen. If these factors are taken into consideration, would the choice of indicators continue to be what it is as of now? It's interesting to note that I think, the maximum number of indicators you've used for a particular theme is 4, and the minimum number of indicators you've used for another theme is 1. And I want to look at that one, and that one is, about minorities. Let's take note of what that one indicator is about minorities. We are looking at number of minority children given pre-metric scholarship. Now, if Dr. Nirmala Murthy's submission is taken seriously, and we say instead of 4, let's have 1, and that captures reality better, I would ask then, maybe, in terms of systems analysis, that's the correct approach. But then it depends on which one indicator you're going to choose. I would ask, for example, supposing you find out how much of drinking water the Muslim community in a ghetto gets in Bangalore. I think that would be a far superior indicator to what we have on board. In other words, I'm asking again and again, what is the basis on which the choice of indicators is made? We've referred to the Constitution in the opening stage, and that is where we get a set of values from. When we are talking of, if development is for justice, then it has to be economic justice, social justice, political justice. And I think that is beautifully captured in the preamble to the Constitution of India. So that is one place from where I think these parameters should be derived. Professor Upendra Bakshi, who is a guru for all of us, he is fond of saying that the Constitution of India is a footnote to the preamble to the Constitution of India. So if you examine the preamble to the Constitution of India and reflect upon it, then what would be the indicators that we are likely to choose? Having said this much, let me now try and illustrate my concerns, and I will choose for that the question of justice in relation to children. 5 indicators have been selected: crime against children, percentage of child labor, percentage of beneficiaries under ICDS, child sex ratio, percentage of malnourished children. I think these last 3 are excellent indicators. What is it that is missing here? I would, think that what is missing is adequate inquiry into government schools. There is almost universal consensus, especially after the right to free and compulsory education. We have 11 lakh government schools in India. Yeah? And each of these schools have 1.5 teachers. And the number of classrooms is also proportionate to that. And of course, you have under the education theme used Education Development Index. So when we look at the government schools, and please, we must remember that the children who go to government schools are from the excluded communities. Very clear demarcation, clearer and clearer as the days go by. They are children of the Dalits, they are children of the tribal people, they are children of the Muslim community if they are not landed up in a madrasa, they are children of the Ati Pichada, the OBCs who are the most backward. It is they who go to the government school. And what happens in that government school? In Delhi, there was recently information to say that 8,000 new classrooms have been added to government schools. If there are 50 students per classroom, that means 4 lakh new children can attend in the classrooms. Now, is that not a relevant indicator? How I think, when we talk of child labor, there is consensus among us now that the most relevant factor in respect of child labor is to find out whether the children are going to school. And that has become a fundamental right. And here it's useful, even for reflecting further, that you have Article 23 in the Constitution which says no child labor in factories, mines, and in hazardous occupations. Article 21A is a directly contrasting one. It says free and compulsory education. 23 is a negative fundamental right, and 21A is a positive fundamental right. The state must do something about it. It's a governance responsibility that the state must have enough classrooms. What is multi-grade teaching all about? Multi-grade teaching means one teacher stands in the middle of a sham classroom and children of 4 or 5 grades sit together and you expect teaching to happen there? And then the premise is, no, government schools can't function, only privatization will solve the problem. My question there is, how about Kendriya Vidyalayas? There's a queue to get admission there. They are run by the government. So there is a political will in order to run government schools properly if it is for children of the armed forces and the bureaucracy. But if it is for children of the excluded populations, one classroom is enough. So I would plead strongly that understanding the number of classrooms per school is the best indicator to find out whether you are rendering justice to children in India. And maybe you will even find a correlation that the maximum number of classrooms for the government schools is in Kerala. And that is why you have such a high percentage of literacy and no child. Please note, no child labor in Kerala. Yeah? Except that children from neighboring states may come into Kerala. But no household in Kerala can ever send a child to labor. The social milieu there will not allow it. They'll ask, why is your child not in school? So I think this is just in order to illustrate for lack of time. But then I want to link it up with something else, and that is essential infrastructure. When you're looking at essential infrastructure, it is power, it is water, it is road and communications, it is housing. Why shouldn't school be there as an essential infrastructure? So I think it is there that I ask whether there is a subconscious, major, inarticulate premise operating in the PSC. And I hope that criticism will be taken in a friendly way and that we examine this aspect. I think, coming to this, it's a question of this consultation with a handful of experts is a very welcome step with all its limitations. So we welcome that. We congratulate PSC for having initiated that. But please remember that expertise in India comes from different silos. It may be academic expertise, it may be professional expertise, it may be bureaucratic expertise. There's another area of expertise, and it's a huge expertise, and that is civil society. Every single social issue in India has world-class expertise in civil society. Please consult them also. And therefore, I ask a methodological question. By what methodology will you arrive at the indicators to be selected for this study? I think that is perhaps the most interesting aspect that we may like to look at. Let me do the same in respect of another aspect, and that is relating to crime, atrocities, violent crimes. For lack of time, let me go to delivery of justice. If you look at delivery of justice, you're looking at pendency, you're looking at vacancy in the High Court. I would say that if you look at, let us say, the social composition of who is an under trial, how many under trials are there and what is their social composition? If there are people who have done that study in America and find that the percentage of blacks who are in custody are grossly disproportionate to their percentage in the population. I bet that is the same scenario so far as the Dalits are concerned. Or if you look at, who are the ones who have been under death sentence. A colleague of mine, Dr. Anup Surendranath, studied all those who were under death penalty in India, some 600 and odd, and they were shocked to see who are the people there, the social composition of them, the absolute lack of opportunity to get proper, representation. Or if you look at who are the guys who get bail, or those who get off the hook, if it is Salman, what is his name, Salman? Salman Khan. Salman Khan, then what happens to justice. Or if it is a rich person, the moment the FIR is filed, he gets a heart attack and he is admitted to a hospital. So that is where actual dispensation of justice is happening. How do we? I know that it is easy to talk this way, but I only want to emphasize that in respect of each set of indicators, there needs to be I ask, is there a better methodology in order to identify indicators? And that, I think, would be a very valuable contribution. So if you ask me what is missing, I think what are the best indicators? For example, in relation to crime, is the juvenile the most important factor in finding out about a rape case? grossly exaggerated, very grossly exaggerated. The media is talking rubbish on that issue and not able to take into consideration. So there, if you ask me, I think the reality in respect of excluded communities must come on board, and indicators must help to capture even that. So I've already referred to the methodology of selecting indicators, and then is there any new idea? The third aspect which was asked of us.
So the main reasons why we have selected the particular data, particular indicators you have mentioned are basically three. One, is the data available? If the data is not available, if the data of how much minority community is being serviced by public standpoints of water is not available, and we cannot manufacture it. So in a way we are bound down, limited by the availability of data in the public domain, number one. Number two, how does the state, what is the role of the state in that particular issue? If it is a situation which the state has no control over, for example, relationship with Pakistan, the state government has no role in it. We have taken only that data where the state has a particular role to play in improvement of the lives of the people. And thirdly, the impact of society at large. And I would like to refer to your observation regarding education. Education, yes, may have been included, could have been included in essential infrastructure, but the fact that we have included it as part of human development, health and education, necessarily means that we have considered it not as infrastructure, but as development of human resources. And if you look at EDI, Educational Development Index, it takes into account about 40 separate indicators, 40, in which availability of infrastructure is there, pupil-teacher ratio is available, dropout is available, literacy rate is available. It's a combination which reflects entire educational development status of a state. So we have put education as a very important indicator, not in essential infrastructure, but in human development. But I think the point that you have raised is the rationale for selection of 67 indicators. Can that be fine-tuned a bit more? Can we tweak it in such a manner that it reflects more accurately the composite metrics that we're trying to present? And if we are able to do that, we will be achieving better results in what we do. So I take this point which Mr. Kulkarni and Mr. Professor Matthew has stated very, very seriously. While it may not be possible to accept all the viewpoints that will be coming out now and a little later, we have noted down all these points and we'll get back. You've given us a lot of homework to do. We have to get back and work on it. Let me wind up this particular session by thanking all the panelists